librarian here at Elsley Public Library in Middlebury, and we are very proud to have Lieutenant Governor Zuckerman here to talk about the growing issue of banned and challenged books across the United States.
I want you to move this over here so that the folks that aren't speaking, excuse me, don't have to be looking at the backsides of the people that are. I'm David Zuckerman, your Lieutenant Governor, and I'm going to give a couple minutes about why I'm doing this banned book reading tour across the state. Then each of us will do a few minutes of a thought from our perspective and a reading, and then we'll open it up for really just a conversation. And this came to me, this idea, back in this late winter, early spring, as we started seeing in the national headlines more and more conversations, if we can call it that, in some other states where altering curricula, banning books that talk about history, banning or language or conversations in classrooms around history of our country and of different race and ethnic issues, as I'm imagining some of you are aware of, but I can go into more detail later. Book banning, book challenges, and even in Vermont, where we haven't had any successful challenges to being banned yet that I know of, we have had some candidates for school board and select board in some communities, and some fairly heated community conversations around curricula or raising Black Lives Matter flags or the like. And as that was elevating by state leaders in some other states, I felt it would be valuable and important to have the conversation in Vermont on a community level, but also as a statewide official to say, you know what, there are some of us with a different perspective about critical thinking, broadening discussion and dialogue, making sure that there are materials in schools that teach the full range of history and also that are available to students who might be feeling like they're not reflected in much of the readings or the literature, to have an opportunity to see that they are full-fledged members of our communities as well, even if not always depicted in history books or some of the other books that are chosen in the literary teachings. And they've been wonderful conversations. I do want to express something that I think is really important as we talk about maybe book bans and challenges, and maybe certainly for me, the troubles I have with that, reflecting through history of what that sometimes portends with respect to moving towards more authoritarian governance systems, really erasing people and cultures from history and from the present, but also that everyone is allowed their opinion. So in this room, if you have a concern about a book or a topic and you would maybe move in the direction of wanting something banned, I want to make sure you feel comfortable expressing that you have concern about a book and what that concern might be. And we can have a conversation about what does banning do, what are individual rights and freedoms and liberties in a respectful way. Because one of the other things that is frustrating for me as an elected official, and I have been mostly in, but occasionally out of politics for much of the last 25 years, is the devolution of dialogue and the devolution of the ability to have different opinions in a room and have respectful conversations. So I would just ask that as we have this conversation, we make sure we maintain respect from people of whatever the perspective they have, as long as we present our respective perspectives in a respectful way. Finger pointing, hopefully not auditory finger pointing either, would be helpful. So with that, two of your lovely local librarians, please welcome. We'll be each speaking briefly and reading from a passage, and if you've come in later, you may or may not have gotten one of the zines that Lisa Gerlach, my Chief of Staff, has available and can come hand out. I also want to mention, as Lieutenant Governor, you may have heard about this because your local library has that information up. You may have heard about it from some different publications that have covered it. But also, I do send out a Lieutenant Governor newsletter about official doings as Lieutenant Governor. This is not a political list. You won't get fundraising emails and so forth. I'm here officially as your Lieutenant Governor, so I think it would be inappropriate to solicit your contact information for the campaign side. But if you're interested in getting a newsletter that comes out about once a week or so during the session, less frequently during the off session, about the goings-on of Montpelier or what I'm talking about or amplifying, please feel free to sign up. Your address is not necessary if you give an email, because we prefer sending it out by email. What else? I think that's most of the what's that? Oh, right. Along with that, we do have a reporter here. This is on maybe going to be on public access or on the library page. We also have a reporter, a local person who's doing a story actually for the Boston Globe. But if you speak, can you speak loudly so that you can hear it? But also, if you don't want to be quoted, just feel free to say that, and we'll respect that as well. So without further ado, okay, Catherine, I guess we'll go first. So welcome your own librarian.
Sounds like you're about to drop some beats.
There. Can everyone hear me?
Oh,
Yes.
Okay. So, as I introduced myself before, my name is Catherine Liberty. I am the teen librarian at Elsley Public Library, and book banning and challengers are one of my passions, partly because about looking at the top 10 list this year, about 3/4 of them are teen books. I've chosen to read today, before I do a little discussion, some of you may be familiar with it, The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, which was published in 2017, kind of at the beginning of the peak of Black Lives Matter. It's critically acclaimed, spent 60 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, yet in 2017 it was among the top 10 most banned books in the country, and it remains in the top 20 today. So the piece I'm going to read out, for anyone who's not familiar with Hate U Give, Black teen star witnesses the police shooting of her unarmed friend. And it talks about the repercussions from that. So I'm going to read a passage in which the main character is talking to her father about Khalil, the boy who was murdered. And this is in reference to the rapper Tupac Shakur. Tupac said, "Thug life meant the hate you give little infants fucks everyone." I censor myself. This is my daddy I'm talking to, you know? You know about that? Yeah, Khalil told me what he thought it means. We were listening to Tupac right before, you know. All right, so what do you think it means? You don't know, I asked? I know, I want to hear what you think. Here he goes, picking my brain. Khalil said, "It's about what society feeds us as youth and how it comes back and bites them later. I think it's about more than youth, though. I think it's about us, period." Us who, he asks. Black people, minorities, poor people, everybody at the bottom of society. The oppressed, says Daddy. Yeah, we're the ones who get the short end of the stick, but we're the ones they fear the most. That's why the government targeted the Black Panthers, right? Because they were scared of the Panthers. Uh-huh, Daddy says. The Panthers educated and empowered the people. The tactic of empowering the oppressed goes even further back than the Panthers, though. Name one. Is he serious? He always makes me think. This one takes me a second. The slave rebellion of 1831, I said. Nat Turner empowered and educated other slaves, and it led to one of the biggest slaves revolts in history. All right, you're on it. He gives me a dab. So what's the hate they're giving the little infants in today's society? Racism? You gotta get a little more detailed than that. Think about Khalil and his whole situation before he died. He was a drug dealer. It hurts to say that. And possibly a gang member. Why was he a drug dealer? Why are so many people in our neighborhood drug dealers? I remember what Khalil said. He got tired of choosing between lights and food. They need money, I say, and they don't have a lot of other ways to get it. Right, lack of opportunities, Dad said. Corporate America doesn't bring jobs to our communities, and they damn sure ain't quick to hire us. Then shit, even if we do have a high school diploma, so many of the schools in our neighborhoods don't prepare us well enough. That's why when your mama talked about sending you and your brother to Williamson, I agreed. Our schools don't get the resources to equip you like Williamson does. It's easier to find some crap than it is to find a good school around here. Now think about this, he says. How did the drugs even get in our neighborhood? This is a multi-billion-dollar industry we're talking about, baby. That shit is flown into our communities, but I don't know anyone in the private jet, do you? No. Exactly, drugs come from somewhere and they're destroying our community. You got folks like Brenda who they think need them to survive, and then you got the Khalils who think they need to sell them to survive. The Brendas can't get jobs unless they're clean, and they can't pay for rehab unless they get jobs. When the Khalils get arrested for selling drugs, they either spend most of their life in prison, another billion-dollar industry, or they have a hard time getting a real job and probably start selling drugs again. That's the hate they're giving us, baby. A system designed against us. That's thug life. I hear you, but Khalil didn't have to sell drugs, I say. You stopped doing it. True, but unless you're in his shoes, don't judge him. It's easier to fall into that life than it is to stay out of it, especially in a situation like this. Now one more question. Really? Damn, he's messed with my head enough. Yeah, really, he mocks in a high tone. I don't even sound like that. After everything I've said, how does thug life apply to the protests and the riots? I have to think about that one for a minute. Everybody's pissed because 115, which is the police officer, hasn't been charged, I say, but also because he's the first one to do something like this and get away with it. It's been happening and people will keep rioting until it changes. So I guess the system's still giving hate and everybody's still getting fucked. Daddy laughs and gives me a dab. My girl, watch your mouth. But yeah, that's about right. And we won't stop getting fucked till it changes. That's the key, it's gotta change. So that was a passage for The Hate U Give. It was banned, first reason language. The F word appears about 89 times in the book, but compare that to the 800 police violent cases we have every year. People who are against critical race theory are opposed to this book, anti-police, and the depiction of drug use, though it's not used by any of the main characters. Right now, I picked The Hate U Give because right now the book bans and challenges are split pretty evenly, about 50-50 between BIPOC members of our community and LGBTQIA+ members, either on the topics or the main characters themselves, which is why I wanted to pick The Hate U Give. I work with a lot of teens in this community. In the world of unicorns and rainbows, there wouldn't be homophobia, there wouldn't be suicide, there wouldn't be sexual assault, there wouldn't be police violence. But I can tell you that teens in our community and teens of Vermont and teens across the nation are dealing with this thing because we don't live in the land of unicorns and rainbows. And those teens deserve to see themselves in the books that they read. Because not only are books mirrors that allow you to reflect yourself, they're also windows that allow you to have empathy into other people's experiences that you may not ever be in their shoes. So I just want to stand here and advocate the freedom to read, and that these books, especially teen ones, need to be accessible to everyone. We're lucky enough, we have a wonderful independent bookstore in town, but a lot of places in the country don't, and teens don't have the opportunity to go on a website. The library is the last place they have, and for them that can be a lifesaver. So thank you everyone, and thank you for continuing our fight.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And next we have Tricia. So, just
Hey,
let you
guys.
forward.
Usually don't use microphones, so excuse me. I have to say, I was in the unfortunate position of having so many great books to choose from today, right? It was really hard to narrow things down. We've got so many wonderful books downstairs, and books about menstruation, books about gender identity, books with black faces, brown faces, all of those things. Books end up on lists and challenges all the time. Now, as both a librarian and a parent here in Middlebury, we are not a super diverse community. In Vermont, I know when I was growing up, Vermont was the second whitest state in the country, and I don't know where we fall right now, but it's got to be close. Yeah. So, as a parent, it's very important to me that I give my kids as much exposure to other lives, other faces, other beliefs, other everything. And it gets harder and harder when people start taking away the things that expose them to the other, right? So Catherine touched on mirrors and windows. There's a wonderful article about how books are mirrors, windows, and sliding glass doors. They reflect yourself, they give you a window into others' lives and experiences, and they're a sliding door that lets you enter into those worlds and experiences and develop your empathy for what that is like. And it is so important that we have books from a wide range for our children to see, experience, empathize with what's going on. So like I said, there were so many options. It was really hard for me to pick. I'm going to talk about this one in a minute, but I actually want to read you guys When Aiden Became a Brother. It's by Kyle Lugoff, he writes picture books and chapter books. He's been getting quite a few awards lately, and they're all deserved. When Aiden was born, everyone thought he was a girl. His parents gave him a pretty name. His room looked like a girl's room, and he wore clothes that other girls liked wearing. But as Aiden got bigger, he hated the sound of his name. He felt like his room belonged to someone else. And he always ripped or stained his clothes accidentally on purpose. Everyone thought he was just a different kind of girl. Some girls had rooms full of science experiments and bug collections. Lots of girls didn't wear dresses. But Aiden didn't feel like any kind of girl. He was really another kind of boy. It was hard to tell his parents what he knew about himself, but it was even harder not to. It took everyone some time to adjust, and they learned a lot from other families with transgender kids like him. Aiden explored different ways of being a boy. He tried out lots of names until one stuck. They changed his bedroom into a place where he belonged. He also took much better care of his new clothes. Then one day, Mom and Dad had something to tell him. "I'm going to have a baby," Mom announced. "A baby?" Aiden said. "Does that mean I get to be the big brother?" "Of course," said Dad, ruffling his hair. Aiden thought that being a big brother was an important job for a boy like him. He wanted to make sure this baby would feel understood right away. The baby needed clothes, so Aiden and his mom went shopping. There were so many choices. Would the baby like seahorses or penguins better? "Are you having a boy or a girl?" asked a lady. Aiden didn't like it when people asked if he was a boy or a girl, and he hoped the baby couldn't hear yet. He was glad when Mom just smiled and said, "I'm having a baby." The baby's room needed to be painted, so Aiden and his dad went to the hardware store. Dad chose a gallon of sky blue paint, and Aiden added a puffy cloud white. "Are you excited for your new brother or sister?" asked the paint guy. "I'm excited to be a big brother," Aiden said. The paint guy looked confused. Aiden could tell that he wanted to ask a different question and was glad to have his dad there with him. The big rollers were fun to paint with. "This room feels just like being outside," Aiden exclaimed. He had always felt trapped in his bedroom before they fixed it, but his new sibling wouldn't have to feel that way. "You're right," said Dad. "Let's make some shapes in the clouds." Every baby needs a name. Aiden loved getting to choose his own, but he remembered that it had been hard for his parents to let go of the name they gave him. He looked for names that could fit this new person no matter who they grew up to be. Willow, sage, pine, forest, sky. Babies needed someone to read to them, so Aiden practiced and practiced and practiced. Dad wanted to teach Aiden how to change diapers. Maybe later, said Aiden. He decided that picking flowers for his mom was more important. 2 weeks before the baby's due date, Aiden started to worry. Maybe he should have picked different clothes. The blue walls might be too bright. He wished he could ask the baby which name they liked best. Mom came to tuck him in. "Are you feeling okay, sweetie?" she asked. Aiden put his hands over where he thought the baby's ears would be. "Do you think the baby will be happy with everything?" he whispered. "I don't want them to feel like I did when I was little, but what if I get everything wrong? What if I don't know how to be a good big brother?" Mom hugged him tight. "When you were born, we didn't know you were going to be our son. We made some mistakes, but you helped us fix them. And you taught us how important it is to love someone for exactly who they are. This baby is so lucky to have you, and so are we." The next morning, Aiden found the boxes of his old baby pictures. He looked so different back then. It hadn't been easy, but he liked the boy he was growing into. Maybe everything wouldn't be perfect for this baby. Maybe he would have to fix mistakes he didn't even know he was making. And maybe that was okay. Bye, Daddy. Aiden knew how to love someone, and that was the most important part of being a brother. It's a baby. The end. I feel like I've used up that time. I'll mention that. So, you can probably guess just from that book why it's been challenged or banned in a lot of elementary schools. Right? Main character is transgender. One of the things I love about that book is it's really not about the character being a transgender character. It's about the character struggling with becoming a big brother. Right? And the worries of how do I do this? What if I do something wrong? All the parents in this room know those feelings very, very well. Right? So I love when Aiden became a brother. I was so excited when we got it in. And as an extra bonus, all the main characters are BIPOC, people of color. Right? So it's always wonderful areas of opening windows for kids to see what other families may go through, what their lives are like. I brought Everywhere Babies with me. Now this one's a little tricky, but it's what I usually bring out when I'm talking to college classes or parents who are bringing me their concerns about book bans. And they want to chat with me about it. So, although Everywhere Babies has not had, as far as I know, an official challenge or ban, in 2021, the Florida Citizens Alliance did put out a list of 68 titles that included LGBTQ content, which they felt should be removed from all schools within their county. All schools within Florida, really. According to them, they were breaking Florida law by making those books available to children. Everywhere Babies was on that list. However, because it was not a formal challenge, they didn't go through any of the challenge processes that the school districts had. It was never recorded as a formal challenge and never made it to the point of being a banned book where they actually took it off the shelf. However, they threw it out there on social media for everyone to see all of these horrible books that can contained LGBTQ content. And the author was shocked. So Everywhere Babies, if you look through it, it is a beautiful book. This happens to be the book that I read to my children to get them ready for having a younger sibling. I used it last year for a 6-week storytime session with babies, toddlers, and their parents. And it is a book about babies and all the things babies can do. They eat, they get rocked, they play games, they're carried, they make noise, they have fun, there are toys. It is a heartwarming, wonderful, squishy sort of baby book, right? And yet, how dare, in this middle page, there are 2 men walking with their arms around each other. There are 2 women walking side by side, different color skin. Right? So my problem, my big frustration, right, is that although this was never a formal challenge, this is never a formal, it was never banned, this is where things are going, right? It's that slippery slope when you start to take things away. Where does that end? Where does it go? So, I'm really thrilled to see you all here today. Thank you for coming to listen and hopefully participate in some dialogue, and I really appreciate that you're all here. Thank you.
Thank you. So I usually bring 2 books. I only read one. I'm going to read from Beloved by Toni Morrison, which was a textbook of mine in high school. But also want to just point out another option for you in your, if you're interested in perusing options of books that are banned. And Tango Makes 3, which is based on a zoo in New York. I believe it's set in the back, true story, back in 1998. A zookeeper essentially gave 2 male penguins who were building a nest and swimming together and playing together and clearly being together, an egg to brood and hatch and raise, which is then hatches into Tango and takes 2 to Tango, and Tango Makes 3. So that's one book as an optional reading, and it is literally a true story, and it has been challenged and banned. I'm going to read from Beloved in part because this is a book that many people have read. It's well-regarded, Pulitzer Prize-winning book, color purple. There's numerous books out there that you're familiar with that at one point or another in time have been banned. And again, back to, as just mentioned by Tricia, where does it start, where does it end? And it's not to say that there are books out there that are banned that you may not like, you may not feel comfortable reading, or you may not want your kid to read for one reason or another. But the conversation of banning is curious because who decides what's banned, right? There may be a population out there right now that's pushing against some of these books that we're discussing, and they're on this list of challenged and banned books. But sometimes with folks that want to ban books, I point out, in fact, I know in one community, some members of the community, somewhat to push back, presented the Bible as a book to be banned. Because if you selectively choose phrases, paragraphs, chapters, whatnot, from the Bible, there's certainly some depictions that some of those same people in another book would say, how could a child ever be exposed to that? But also, what if a community said, we feel that guns are violent and present a sort of violent depiction of society? What if we should ban all books that have any guns in them? And I present that as a way to bring up the topic with someone who may be inclined towards banning some of these books, to remind them that who is in power and who makes that decision can ultimately really change which books would get banned. Which is why I present sort of zero tolerance to banning any books, because it's all in the eye of the beholder, who has the power in the moment, and maybe it's something that you might be a part of. That would be effective. And I present that just as something, as part of this conversation, is again to help folks think about ways to discuss this with folks that might have a different perspective. That isn't just, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong, but to really, again, open windows into looking at things from a different perspective. So, Beloved by Toni Morrison. Some of you may have read it, I'm assuming, others maybe not. It's quite a powerful book around slavery, and main character is a woman who has escaped slavery and has had to almost do a bit of a Sophie's Choice at one moment, if you know that movie. The part of the book I'm going to read is about the setting is a field away from the main slave housing area in the woods. It seems it's very much sort of an escape for a lot of the folks on the plantation. And the main character in this moment is Baby Suggs, which is the sort of matriarch grandmother of the group. It's just a moment of her speaking and guiding the community that's living in slavery. After situating herself on a huge flat-sided rock, Baby Suggs bowed her head and prayed silently. The company watched her from the trees. They knew she was ready when she put her stick down. Then she shouted, "Let the children come!" And they ran from the trees towards her. "Let your mothers hear you laugh," she told them, and the woods rang, and the adults looked on and could not help but smile. Then, "Let the grown men come," she shouted. They stepped out one by one from among the ringing trees. "Let your wives and your children see you dance," she told them, and ground life shuddered under their feet. Finally, she called the women to her. "Cry," she told them, "for the living and the dead, just cry." And without covering their eyes, the women let loose. It started that way, laughing children, dancing men, crying women, and then it got mixed up. Women stopped crying and danced. Men sat down and cried. Children danced. Women laughed. Children cried, until, exhausted and riven, all and each lay about the clearing, damp and gasping for breath. In the silence that followed, Baby Suggs, holy, offered up to them her great big heart. She did not tell them to clean up their lives or to go and sin no more. She did not tell them they were the blessed of the earth, its inheriting meek, or its glory-bound pure. She told them that the only grace they could have was the grace they could imagine. That if they could not see it, they would not have it. "Here," she said, "in this here place we flesh that weeps, laughs. Flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it. Love it hard. Yonder they do not love your flesh. They despise it. They don't love your eyes, they just as soon pick them out. No more do they love the skin on your back. Yonder they flay it. And oh my people, they do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands. Love them. Raise them up and kiss them. Touch others with them. Pat them together. Stroke them on your face, because they don't love that either. You gotta love it. You. And no, they ain't in love with your mouth. Yonder out there, they will see it broken and break it again. What you say out of it, they will not heed. What you scream of it, they do not hear. What you put into it to nourish your body, they will snatch away and give you leavens instead. No, they don't love your mouth. You gotta love it. This is flesh I'm talking about here. Flesh that needs to be loved. Feet that need to rest and to dance. Backs that need support. Shoulders that need arms. Strong arms, I'm telling you. And oh, my people out yonder, hear me. They do not love your neck, unnoosed and straight. So love your neck. Put a hand on it, grace it, stroke it, and hold it up. And all your inside parts that they just as soon slop for hogs, you've got to love them. The dark, dark liver, love it. Love it. And the beating and beating heart, love that too. More than eyes or feet. More than lungs that have yet to draw free air. More than your life-holding womb and your life-giving private parts, hear me now. Love your heart, for this is the prize. saying no more. She stood up and then danced with her twisted hip. The rest of what her heart had to say, while the others opened their mouths and gave her the music. Long notes held until the 4-part harmony was perfect enough for their deeply loved flesh. There's a lot of history being erased in parts of the country, and it's so important to know our history. It doesn't mean folks today are necessarily guilty for what happened in the past, which is one of the arguments people make. This makes our children feel guilty. It makes us feel guilty. If you don't do these things, you're not guilty for them. But at the same time, knowing it, and also learning and knowing areas of inequality and disparate policing and so forth are important, because that might be something that in the future, if you do nothing about it or don't stand up to try to change what our societal norms are, your own actions are what you can feel guilt for. And even then, it's you get to choose what you feel guilt for, not the truth of the past, but it's important to know it. So with that, the conversation can go wherever you want it to go, whether it's questions about these books or what our librarians face day to day, whether it's conversations that may or may not be happening in communities that you're aware of, or things in other states, or policies that might want to be thought of. Anybody have a follow-up question? Please.
I've got a question. Who are the banners? Are they mostly the school boards or libraries or?
Yeah.
Is it mostly? I guess I didn't realize so much.
Do you guys say
Yeah,
real
sure.
quick? So, give you the spiel I usually give, so hopefully you're all along for the ride. Talking about banned books can be confusing. Right? So people go, it's not banned, I see it right there on the shelf. Banning a book doesn't mean it disappears. It doesn't mean that it's gone from everywhere, right? So there are different levels in this process that we're talking about, right? So it starts with someone who feels like this book is so wrong, no one should be reading it. It should not be exposed, we should not expose, usually, children to this content. And so that could be a parent, it could be a school board member, it could be a community member, it could be a teacher, it could be anyone, right? And they will go usually to the librarian, although it can also be a school principal, it can also be someone involved in a university, and say, I don't want this book to be here anymore. So hopefully, all those places have a lovely policy for request of reconsideration. And ideally, the process goes something like this. They're saying, well, thank you so much for telling us that. Here is a packet that I would love for you to read through, fill out, and bring it back to me. And we can start the process of reconsideration. And that packet usually asks things like, what is the book that you don't want on our shelf? Why, specifically, don't you want it? What about this book? Why do you think that we might have this book on the shelf? How do you think it ended up here in the first place? Right? So there are questions which hopefully mean that the person has read the book, has thought about the content in that book, right? And still, by the end of it, they feel like, nope, this should not be here. That packet goes back to, in our case, it would be the director of the library. And they then get a copy of the book, read it, and decide either, we understand what you're saying, but there's still some really great content in here. There's still very valid reasons why it should be on our shelf for everyone to access, so it's going to stay. Or, you're right, this is not appropriate for this occasion, and it needs to come off our shelf, right? If whatever decision is, here at the Ilsley, and again, this is hoping everywhere has a really great policy for reconsideration. If the person challenging isn't happy with that decision, either way, they can appeal and it goes to the library board of trustees. And in that instance, all the members of the board get a copy of the book, read the book, meet to discuss its merits and its pitfalls, and then come to a decision, whether it stays on the shelf or comes off the shelf. Right? And at that point, the decision is final for this institution. So there are, again, levels. You'll notice this list is of banned and challenged books. So a challenge means that someone came to the people in charge and said, no, right? But that doesn't mean it came off the shelf. A banned book means that someone in charge somewhere said, you know, you're right. Let's take it away, right? So there are different levels, and it could be that a school takes a book off the shelf. So an elementary school takes the book off the shelf, but it's still available at the middle school, right? It could be a whole lot of things. One of the big arguments is, well, it's just not available at the school, but you can still buy a copy. Catherine touched on this. Not everyone can buy a copy, whether because of access or money, right? That's why libraries are this last bastion of free access. So I see you've been so patient. Yes?
Yes, may I ask the Lieutenant Governor a question?
Please do.
Thank you. Lieutenant Governor, the previous speaker addressed the process. You have the legislative perspective, and you're here with us. Would you spend equal time focusing on executive branch and legislative and what's going on there? Get anything done?
Right. And I would say thank you for the very in-depth and nuanced aspect. I was going to go a little higher level, like brevity, and you mentioned, by the way, that the school board would all read the book.
Yeah.
I think that may or may not always be the case.
Yes.
When
Talking about good.
Right. But the process would be that typically there's a board, either it's a trustees of a library or a school board, that would be those final arbiters. But it would be members of the public in one form or another who would bring forth the challenge, and processes may or may not be in place to go through that. With respect to the legislature, one state, Illinois, has actually passed a law to not allow books to be banned in the schools. I believe it may be schools and libraries, because there has been this push at the local level, and really a lot of it is often bullying and intimidation, where 10 or 15 people will go to a meeting that used to only literally have 1 or 2 people attend, and be very vocal and very loud and very angry. And until the school board acquiesces or the library trustees acquiesce, they're really quite vocal. And so I think that may have been one of the reasons, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's the majority of the community. So in Illinois, they've passed a law to take away that local control, which in and of itself is an interesting debate and discussion to have. But there are some legislators in Vermont who are considering introducing such legislation this coming year that I've learned about since I started this company. They're probably in tandem. I'm going to be like, I was out front. They've been thinking about it too, and they are planning to introduce some legislation. Whether there could be an executive order of such, probably not. But I don't know whether this governor would or wouldn't do that. And a whole different conversation is how often the governor and I communicate. But he doesn't usually ask me for my opinion on the law. Let's leave it at that. Yes, please.
Recently, the parents of Hispanic and Middle Eastern heritage sued the county to opt their children out of reading these kinds of books. Therein lies another challenge. They have an answer, we reculturate these parents, we allow them out their children out, and introduce them to these books gradually. How do we get that? Actually, the parents lost the lawsuit. The judge is very liberal, but there is a challenge there for these kind of groups of people in the country who disapprove of these kind of things.
Well, I think there's a couple things there. One is we all live under the same law and constitution. Repeat the question.
Yeah.
So the question, this person is from Montgomery County, I think you said Maryland, and there was a group of, I think you said Middle Eastern and and Hispanic folks of origin who have challenged some books that were being taught. And so there you have an interesting dilemma of cultural clashes and so forth, maybe beyond the demographic of, if I can be so bold to say, the vast majority or everybody in this room. And so I guess what I would respond with respect to that is, no matter where someone is originally from or what their culture is, because ultimately all these conversations are about varying cultures, it doesn't actually fully matter which culture one is from and whether one's indigenous or multi-generational here or new American. We live under the same Constitution and general set of principles and laws around free speech and democracy, and for now believing in generally public education and public information. And I do think it's important to try to have that conversation with folks. Not maybe in the heated moment of the meeting that's happening, but try to get a contact and say, hey, maybe we could go have a cup of coffee over this sometime. Because I feel like so much of the discourse is through the media and is such a rancorous level. But often when you say, well, what are your concerns? And they'll say, well, I don't want my kid exposed to this. And I think it's really important to point out a couple different things. One is, I believe in Vermont, it's until you're 16. As a parent, you can tell your local librarian or your school librarian, I don't want my child to have that material. So you have that right for your own children. But a lot of this conversation is about people trying to take away access to information for everybody else's children. And so letting them know that they may well have that right, and you could do the research in Maryland or in that community, that they have some say. And there's a lot of fraught information out there that's, every kid is getting, these books as part of their curriculum. Really, it's more often a kid that maybe is trying to explore some sense of themselves, who's often approaching a school librarian or a community librarian because they don't have information at home, but they might be a little too afraid to bring it up. That is then, a librarian says, what's the appropriate book to help this child at their stage in life know that there is a mirror out there and there are other people like them, and it's okay to be who you are. And I'll briefly mention that in one of these other readings in Manchester, a grandmother and her 10-year-old son had come to the event, and she had a more religious perspective on life and was very concerned about some of the books, particularly on LGBTQ plus issues, and her grandson being exposed to these things. And he raised his hand and said, look, I'm 10 years old. Maybe he didn't say it, she might have said that. And he said, in my teachings and beliefs, pride is a sin. One of the many sins of the Bible. And biblical teaching. And he said, but now I'm in school and pride is getting pushed down my throat. And I paused to reflect on that for a minute. I said, well, interestingly enough, many words have multiple definitions. And I think it is important to think about pride when you're, I'm the best and get out of my way and I know all the answers. It's really not a very good characteristic to have, and it's understandable that form of pride might be something you might want to reconsider being as who you are. But when pride is being discussed in schools, I think the context is much more around kids that have sometimes been bullied or pushed aside or have had to bury who they are. And it's saying, it's okay to be who you are, no matter who you are. Be just proud that you are who you are. Not necessarily boastful in being number one, but just, it's okay to be who you are. There are people like you that you may not know about yet, and that's okay. And we're just saying everyone in the room should be excited about who you are, and go out there and be who you are, and be the best who you are you can be. And I left it at that, because I thought, you know what? For those that don't know, I'm also a farmer. The seed is planted. Let the child take that home, and we'll see whether that seed grows or not. Not all seeds grow, but hopefully the germinate can grow. And so partly it's about trying to find a way to have a conversation, meeting people where they are, and just giving them a little info to maybe expand where they are. usually we don't tend to get people to jump like a cork from one place to another without traveling the space in between. That was a physics reference for those who don't know. Another thought or question about, maybe there's another thing I didn't see. Or anybody else want to reflect on some of the questions that have been asked and offer some other perspectives? Yes, please.
I have a question. It's a long list of banned and challenged books, and you put them together. So I do understand, especially where originally I'm from, so we lived in Russia, and there was what's happening in the US, and banning on all levels. But what's interesting for me about this list, so you put it together, but I agree, banning on different levels is a slippery road in many ways. But you included challenged books. Does it mean that you think that challenging books is as inappropriate as it is banning? So probably, but again, you can answer this question, but you can guess from my question, what is my answer?
Well, I don't know necessarily what your answer is. It would be great to find out your thoughts. But I believe the American Library Association put this list together. PEN America put this together. So I just want to not take credit for work of others as far as finding all the books. To me, certainly challenging is a First Amendment right as well. So go ahead and challenge. But what we have seen in the last few years, I think it's in the zine, is either doubling or tripling, my brain is shorting out on me here, of the number of banned and challenged books in these last couple of years. And so it's a very extreme rise and curve of this happening, which is partly why, as I said at the beginning, I'm having this conversation to push back on some of the narrative that's happening in other places. So I think it's everyone's right, as I said earlier, to have an opinion and to challenge a book. I would hope that not a single challenge would pass anyway. That we trust librarians and teachers and the law, as parents can do for their own children's exposure, to be used appropriately and so forth. But to have a teacher or a school not be able to access material that may well be very appropriate for a particular child, or expand people's minds, like beloved as a high school textbook for me, I think is important that we don't do that.
Yeah. But I think to some extent it's also important that it's possible to question whether the book is appropriate or inappropriate. So I'm not sure whether I understand correctly the challenge, but that's how I understood from.
Yes, challenging a book is saying, I think this book is inappropriate for X. Yeah, sure.
I keep stealing the mic.
No, we can all have the mic. Anything else? And we also can speak without a mic.
Yeah. So, as librarians, Catherine and I have never had a formal challenge. We haven't had to go through the pamphlet and those steps, but we've had a lot of soft challenges, although I feel like that may even be too much. I've had parents come to me before and say, ooh, I don't know about this. Can you tell me why you have it here? Right? And that's been a great conversation. And those conversations have ended in different ways, right? Some of the books, I explain how they fit with our selection development policy and the reasons why we have them on shelf, and I let them know, they're here for these very good reasons. I understand your reservations and would encourage you not to check them out with your child, right? There have been some books that parents have come to me and said, I read this book and I found it in the elementary school collection and it talks about people getting naked. And I was like, oh, okay, well, no, this shouldn't be in the elementary school collection. You are correct. We're going to move it on over to one of the other sections in the building, right? Because sometimes we make mistakes. Sometimes there's content that isn't talked about in reviews, right? I know it's hard to believe I have not read every single book in the children's room, right? So we do the best we can, and we welcome these sorts of questions and discussions. So I've had about books and why we have them on the shelf, right? The difference between those sorts of discussions and a formal challenge and what, as a librarian, for me is so against my beliefs, is that person is saying, it's not enough that I am not going to check this book out. I don't think anyone should be allowed to check this book out, right? And so even if the powers that be decide to keep it and it doesn't get banned, there's still a lot of people out there who feel like it is a totally okay thing to make decisions about what other people can read and be exposed to and know. And that is what is so against the grain for me around even challenges.
I just want to say that sometimes a challenge can be the same thing as an outright ban. There are people out there who all you have to do is just say, well, put a bug in their ear, and then if you're in a classroom, you go to a teacher and say, why do you have this? The teacher may then have to just withdraw it, just because to keep the peace. And that's not okay. Because that's limited. Yeah. And so, you mentioned slippery slopes. Well, that's a slippery slope. So, I think information is good. More is better. I don't think that, as someone, a classroom teacher may not have the same safeguards that a library does in terms of a formal review. They may not have the backing of an administrator. So you have whole classroom collections, shelves being wiped out, being covered, and saying you cannot use these books, and then the books are eventually removed. So the classrooms don't have books in them anymore.
And we cannot put a ban on challenging a book.
But
You're still required to put fabric over these books.
this is not a meeting, this is what's happened.
And that's some policy discussions, and we'll come back to that. So I know Catherine has so much want to add, and I'm going to address a little bit of this in a moment after that.
There was a question about where these bans come from. Prior to 2020, a lot of the bans were brought by individuals, a lot of parents. But now since 2020 and 2021, ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom they've been around for about 20 years, the most complaints they've ever received. And then that increased in 2022 by about 60%. So in about 2021, there are about roughly 1,500 books banned or challenged in the United States. And now 2022, the 2023 statistics aren't out yet, there's 2,500. A lot of these bannings are coming because now parent groups and adult groups are organizing. One such group is Moms of Liberty, who are a pretty conservative group who consider LGBTQIA+ material pornography. And they are organizing. They've got about 200 chapters around the country. And this is why preserving Vermont is important, because every single state around us has a chapter of Moms of Liberty other than Vermont. So yes, we may not have faced a ban or challenge here, but a ban or challenge at one library is a problem for every library because it becomes an epidemic. And it's a slippery slope. And as people have said, you have to ask, where does it end?
Well, and a couple folks have left because it is 5 o'clock, which is when we booked the time for. I was going to briefly address this discussion because I think it's very important. It looks like maybe one more question. And then unfortunately, one of the reasons this was moved earlier is I actually have to get to the airport to catch a flight to DC. I think it is critically important that the right to challenge your book or speak your mind and your concern is upheld. That's part of free speech. I also think it's critically important, and this is part of where I think will address some of what you're talking about, which is civic engagement matters. Being on school boards matters. Being on library trustee boards matters. And I will tell you, as someone who's run for office and tried to get other people to run for office or to get onto local commissions, in Vermont, we have more opportunities for you to be involved at the civic local level to make sure that teacher does have the support through the school board and then the superintendent or the principal and administration. That's part of the onus for this whole conversation that I'm having across the state, is so that if Moms for Liberty, which actually did have a meeting last month in Vermont to try to organize, and I apologize, they partly did it in rebuttal to my readings. I haven't heard much about the size of the meeting. I don't think it was particularly successful. But if challenges and bans come up at the local level, that you are all ready to be a part of that conversation in your community, or to call your friend who lives in another community and help them with some of these arguments, whether it was the, what if all books with guns were taken out? What about your freedoms and liberties that are what, are regularly talked about? But also, you have your freedom and liberty. It's a matter of making sure everybody else does too. And so having some of those, I hate to call them talking points, but some of those arguments, some of those perspectives to offer means a stronger community supporting the teacher, means someone has a right to challenge a book, and then the librarian or the teacher doesn't have to follow through with a shadow ban, or unfortunately in Florida it's actually to protect their jobs, because the way the laws are written, they're afraid if they teach certain material they will lose their job. And that's about civic engagement and who's making the decisions and why democracy matters, and the loop that's closed between authoritarianism limiting information, leading to more power for fewer people, to actually, people power. Did you have one last brief thing?
I just
Yes,
wanted
please.
to share, I am a teacher in
Right.
elementary school, and last year a book was written, and a book called Love in the Library, and it's a book written, the woman who wrote it was a love story set in a World War II incarceration camp for Japanese Americans. It's actually her grandmother's story, and she got a call. Her book was accepted by Scholastic, which, if you don't know, Scholastic is the biggest publisher for children's books. She was over the moon excited that her book was going to get read. It was being published by Scholastic, and when they sent her the edits that they wanted the book to have, in her author's note, she spoke pretty strongly about the problem with racism, and they asked her to edit that because they felt that if they were to publish it, there were some teachers who aren't ready to have those conversations in their communities. So that means that publishers are going to make choices on what books they publish and make available to our students based on the fear of all of these book bans and challenges. And that is a terrible, terrible thing. And Scholastic realized they made a terrible mistake and did retract, and the conversation moved on. But it's just really important that it's on the small, and also I'm dialoguing with teachers across the country, and there are classrooms in Florida and places where they're only allowed to have 3 books in their classroom, places where they're not allowed to have any access to books or have conversations. And we're just really lucky that we're still having these conversations, and just being ready to talk to people about them, I think is also really great. So thank you.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that shows the many different ways that there's the formal challenges and bans, but there's all of these subtle and not so subtle informal ways. But also, a lot of Vermonters know a lot of folks who live in Florida. And so if you know folks who are snowbirds or who live part-time in each place, you can also have that conversation with them to help them with that articulation when they're in what might be a little bit of a hotter environment for this conversation. Because I think a lot of us, I've been learning it every single one of these, a new question that makes me think, which is great. But hopefully you've all gotten something out of it as well. Did you want to add one last quick thought? And then
Just quickly, that a lot of these parent groups kind of disguise themselves as a grassroots movement when they're in fact being organized and funded by special interest groups.
Very much so.
And the loudest group is not always the biggest group. And so I'm really grateful for that zero tolerance policy to help us from avoiding that slippery slope, and that we can trust our librarians. And another line of defense is to trust the kids themselves, because just because they pick up a book does not mean they're going to be indoctrinated by it. We actually, my son and I run a banned book club for teens. We kicked it off a year ago with Fahrenheit 451
Fantastic.
and are still going strong. And so we really appreciate you guys keeping the conversation going and leading it at the line of defense there instead of waiting for it to come to us.
Every comment leads to more comments. One of which is, I think that tolerance is really, and not tolerance. The loudest voices are not always the majority, or whatnot, is something we all have to remember as well. There are people with very different perspectives than us, than me. I can't speak for all of us. And they have a right to their opinion, whether it's the most important opinion the one could wish for, or not, from whoever's perspective. And we have laws around hate speech, and we have laws to protect people from certain language being used. But also, people come from very different places. I grew up in rural Virginia, where 85% of that county voted for Trump. I was there for 2 months every summer. And suburban Boston, where 85% voted for Biden. I know families in both of the sort of extremes. And a lot of them are still, in many ways, very decent people and very caring about the people that they care about. And so there's ways in to reach. But also, another point to bring up with folks that want to ban books or don't want their kids exposed to certain things. I think it's really important to point out that nowadays, unlike the McCarthy era, the material is out there. And far worse material is out there on these little gadgets and on all the other screens that are in our homes. And if we push people away from libraries and away from teachers and those folks that have adult judgment and thinking skills and process, then odds are what they're going to find here is much farther down a path of violence with intimacy, with very unequal partnerships, and things that will potentially really push people in a direction that's far worse than most of the books that are often quoted, which are usually a sliver of the book that is actually teaching a much bigger lesson about co-equal partnerships and respect and other things, using a moment of inequality in those kinds of situations. If I'm not speaking out of turn, I've not read most of them, but this is what I've heard from many who have read many more of the books that have been cited and quoted as horrific. So remind folks that unless they're going to put their child in a little bubble box away from every electronic communication device that ever exists, and that somehow they're going to keep that kid from looking at their friend's phone or their friend's computer or iPad that has internet access, they're actually probably doing more harm than good, keeping them from the librarians. With that, I want to thank our librarians for not only being librarians, first and foremost, but for hosting us in this lovely library, in this beautiful room. These conversations have been amazing all around the state. If anybody wants to follow up, I believe my communication, internet, email is either in that zine, or you can talk with Lisa right afterwards, my chief of staff. Somewhere there's a clipboard. I hope I can find it. Great. If you want to sign up for the Lieutenant Governor newsletter, either hear about more of these events or others that I might hold in the future, or issues and policies or so forth, please feel free to sign up. And thank you all so much for coming. I really do appreciate it.